everybody, and welcome to Think About It Thursday. Today's a very special video because it's part 2 of our Advocacy 101 series, where I'll be joined by special guests to discuss topics such as being your own advocate on university or college campuses, advocacy versus activism, and some pieces of advice for students looking to get involved with the student leadership experience. My guests today are Kalin McCluskey, who is the Executive Director of the Canadian Alliance of Student Associations, or CASA as we call it, and Akanksha, Bhatnagar, who is the Communications and Public Relations Officer for CASA. Students who've been following SMUSA would know that we work very closely with the Canadian Alliance of Student Associations in order to ensure affordable, accessible, and quality post-secondary education, as well as working to make sure that the student voice is always present around the table. I'm going to keep the CASA intro short, but Kalin and Akanksha have been working as champions for students for many years now, and I'm so excited to be speaking with you both today. Thanks for being here.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah, thanks for having us.
Wonderful. So right off the bat, a lot of students may not really know what we mean when we say the word advocacy or what their student association team is talking about when they say they're advocating on a particular issue. So could you both describe in your own words what advocacy is and why it's so important? And maybe I'll start with Kalin this time.
Excellent. So advocacy can mean a lot of things to a lot of different folks. And at CASA, we take a pretty holistic approach as to what it is. And for us, it's about influencing decision-making that is done by decision makers like politicians, but also the public service. And for us, we do that exclusively federal, but our members do it at the local level in their home associations, as well as municipally, which I know SMUSA has done some great work, particularly amid COVID with the city of Halifax. And they also do it provincially, but for us, we just go federal within those. And for us, it's about influencing decision and showing how things work for students, and then proposing solutions that will make the post-secondary system better for students in particular. So there's nuances in that I believe we're going to unpack a little bit here today. But for me, that's kind of what it is. But I come at it from a pretty academic perspective in influencing and all those things. But I'm sure Akanksha has the perspective of a former student leader that'll be much more engaging than my old school academic approach.
Oh, I totally think that Kalin kind of hit it right on the head where, advocacy to me is just being influential and making an influence and making an impact in the area that you're passionate about. So whether that's speaking out about small issues, whether that's speaking out about massive issues that you see on your campus or in your hometown, or, even as simple as, talking to your mom about getting more allowance or something like that. I think that advocacy is pretty simple to do if you're someone that wants to put forward some solutions about problems that you're seeing in the world. So it's important because if you don't say your piece and if you aren't providing the solution to the issues, odds are that other people have the same issues that you do and are just also kind of feeling that they're not important enough to speak out. So I think if you feel like there's something to be said, there likely is something to be said. So go ahead and say it.
Absolutely, that's perfect. And I think it captures kind of what exactly it is that CASA and our SMUSA team are doing on pretty much an almost daily basis at this point. I'm wondering if maybe you both can briefly touch on how or why you decided to become involved with advocacy work, and I'll start with Akanksha this time.
Yeah, so I was involved in student leadership at the University of Alberta. I originally had decided that I wasn't going to get involved in student politics on campus. I just wanted to get my degree and I wanted to leave campus and go down into the big world. And I realized that there was a lot of things happening on campus that I was a little bit confused by and a little bit frustrated by. And the more I talked to my friends, I realized they were frustrated. I subsequently got a job at the University of Alberta Students' Union as kind of a researcher and advisor. And that was when I realized all the hard work that was going into trying to solve these problems. But they needed people to continue to come in and take that to the next level and bring these solutions forward. So while it was difficult for me, especially as a female, to decide to run, I was pretty nervous about the whole experience about running and getting involved in stuff. But I had a really, really supportive group of friends that, told me in the simplest of words, like I said earlier, that if I had something to say, I may as well say it, because if I don't, then somebody else will say it, and they might not say exactly what I wanted to get done. So that was kind of my intro into it, and really watching really incredible student leaders from before me, do a lot of incredible work. And I was really, really honored to be part of that. So when I decided to run for the role of VP Academic and then the role of president, I just kept all of that in mind where, I was lucky to be at the table supporting students and getting whatever it is they wanted to accomplish, but also making sure that post-secondary is more than just the four walls of a classroom where you sit in a lecture hall and listen to somebody speak at you. And I really wanted to immerse myself and allow other students to be immersed as well.
Absolutely. I'll pass it over to Kalin.
Yeah, my story is a little different. Unlike Akanksha, I haven't run for leadership roles and I didn't participate in the student union as a student. I was involved in other areas of campus life, including the residence community and some other areas. But for me, and my work as an advocate is here at CASA, but has been in other roles, including political, specifically on the staffing side. So being that support behind the scenes, the strategizing, and playing up with my skill set, which is usually a little more academic, as you probably have noticed, and trying to find the evidence and the research on things that are lived experiences, but pulling that in with data wherever possible to convince folks who may not see it that way. And that actually kind of has a CASA tie-in for me. In my first year of university, I was in a faculty that was off campus at UMB Fredericton, and it was a big deal that the student union VP advocacy came to our faculty to talk about this thing that they were doing called the wall of debt. And they had these postcards that were bricks, basically, and people were writing on them what their debt load was. During their program and what they expected to complete with. And at the time, my background, I did not come from an affluent background, but I had scholarships. But I always felt like I didn't have as much as my colleagues, and that was kind of paining me at the time. But then I was seeing these numbers that they would be graduating with, and I didn't have that. And I felt very, very privileged in that moment. And then in the aggregate, in seeing them all on my campus come together, of the volume of debt that students were going to be graduating with, and then seeing that come to Ottawa and the pictures of that being on Parliament Hill really made me see that this experience is not unique, that a lot of folks are struggling, and that if we put our collective voices together, we can ask for change and ask for more. So that's kind of how it all started and bloomed. It has that CASA connection. But for me, it's been in supportive roles, a lot of research, and a lot of analytics to make the case for why change should happen and trying to bring in those lived experiences where possible.
Absolutely. I think it's really cool to see the two sides of it, the two types of advocates coming together at the table. So thank you for that. You touched kind of briefly on the why behind the work that you do. And I know for some students, it can feel really daunting to do any form of personal advocacy, like Akanksha talked about, talking to your mom about allowance or whatever form that may be. So I'm hoping you can shed some light on how students on university or college campuses can be their own advocate. And I'll go to Kalin first this time.
Ooh, that's a great question. And I think sometimes can be the $1,000,000 question, especially if you're presented with a lot of significant challenges and don't know where to start. And I think that this can look a lot of different ways, and it can be personal, it can be community based, and it can be even broader. And we see that with lots of students. We see students who are advocating for themselves to get through their programs with what they need, and accommodations and supports as required. We see folks coming together within their student societies and student unions to make things better for the overall condition. And then, of course, we see students involved like yourself, advocating federally and beyond. I think some keys to that is knowing when to stand up for something and make your voice count. And that can be as personal as oneself. And so I think we all have a little drive in us, as they say, to save the world. And sometimes it's okay if that's just saving yourself and making things better for you to get through. And advocating can be as simple as advocating with a professor that, the books that we're using are really expensive and prohibitive. I've heard about these great things that are called open educational resources. Could we have an OER here? Or is there a method by which I can access these materials in a more affordable way? It can be seeing the inequities that some of your classmates are facing and saying, and being a good bystander and ally and saying that this topic is inappropriate, that this can't happen, and demanding better. It can be advocating for mental health. It can be taking your own experience and recognizing that, I'm having a tough time here. There are likely others who can't speak too, and bringing that voice forward. So those are just a few ways, but definitely a $1 million question that is highly personal and as many answers as there are people.
Absolutely. Pass it over to Akanksha.
Yeah, I mean, again, I think Kalin really knocked that one over the head. Like it is $1 million question. It's super unique for everybody as to why they, became passionate about something, whether that's through watching a friend, whether that's through experiencing it themselves. So I would say that if you notice that there is a thorn in your side, or that your friend has a thorn in their side, if there is likely other people that have the same thorn in their side. And it's like, what can you do to just move this thorny bush out of the way? And whether that is talking to your professor, like exactly like Kalin said, it might be as simple as a conversation as to, do you have a more affordable version of this textbook versus, can you make sure that you're putting your slide decks up before class starts? All those things are advocacy. And I think people tend to think that advocacy is massive and it's, big meetings with people and it's big changes and it's $1 million investments, when really it's just trying to make something better for somebody else and for yourself included. And it's not selfish to do self advocacy. It's not, something that you should shy away from. But I think if somebody has a thorn in their side and you are experiencing the same thing, the odds are hundreds of other students feel the same way. So you may as well try to talk to your friends about it, speak up about it, or, if you're the kind of person that wants to stay behind the scenes, research it, try to figure out who else is feeling some way, and you'll find somebody who is willing to put their voice behind an ask that you might have. And I think that, something that I always think about is, will I regret not speaking up in 5 years or 10 years? And sometimes, like, it doesn't seem like a big deal, like the slide deck issue of not putting your slides up. You're like, I won't think about this in 10 years, but you will have made a pretty big impact on a lot of people in that class who, really want to see the slides in advance for whatever reason. So it might be a small issue to you, but if you start to see the world through the lens of other people and how they experience it, hopefully you'll understand that there's more to the world than just, issues that you might personally be impacted by.
Absolutely. I think both those answers are a really great segue into kind of the next topic, which is something that I think has become more and more prevalent with the increased use of social media. And that's kind of the difference between advocacy and activism. And I think normally when we talk about advocacy, it looks a little bit more formal. But I'm wondering if you have any thoughts on what the difference is between the two, whether one is more influential. Maybe I'll start with Akanksha, our resident social media expert on this one.
That is very kind of you. So I think to me, advocacy is, it sounds academic, and Kalin, I'm sure we'll talk about the more academic side of it, but I think because it is kind of the behind the scenes side of work where you are providing, you're seeing an issue, you're trying to explain to people what that issue is, and you're trying to provide a solution. So that A to C, I think, is advocacy. And I think that the B in the middle there of trying to explain to the general public what that issue is what activism is for. So I think they're so important together. They can't exist without each other, but they serve different roles where, for lack of better words, activism might be, public facing, and advocacy might be more of that behind the scenes, like research work or the meetings behind the scenes or the getting into the line by line decisions of a policy. But activism is getting the general public to understand and to agree on the common understanding that, student debt is an issue. And I think that is the work that activists do. They, I think on social media, what I've loved over the past few years is the influence that it has on educating people. Like I myself am constantly educated on Instagram, and I personally am a huge fan of Instagram slide decks where, they might look beautiful and they're eye catching. And I'm a huge fan of that because you're able to learn a lot about issues on campus, learn a lot about issues generally in the world, and, try to understand where people are coming from. So I think that social media is an incredible tool to be able to bring to light issues that people might not have understood prior. And I think Kalin gave a really good example of prior to student social media, or not student social media, just social media, but the wall of debt. I think having conversations about the fact that people's debt was so big, and that for some it might be, not as big, and it might be pretty middle for some people, but I think it's super important that you are able to put those things into context. So social media, I think, is an incredible tool to be an activist, and the barrier to entry is so low for you to get involved in activism that you can be an activist, while sitting in bed and bringing light to issues. What you bringing, I guess, light to conversations that you might have not been able to. Whereas advocacy, I think, is more of that behind the scenes, and I think that one can exist without the other. And I'm really happy that CASA is able to do that with student leaders who are advocates and activists, and with the everyday student that, while they might not be in meetings with ministers, they're definitely acting as activists for CASA as they're sharing and interacting with our work on social media. And sometimes it's as easy as just a like, but sometimes it is a little bit more complicated when you share something to your story and somebody responds to it and, wants to have a conversation about it. And while that's difficult, I think that is the work of an activist. So.
Absolutely. Kalin, is there anything you want to kind of jump in and add?
Yeah, it's just that to Akanksha's points, that she's completely on the mark for where I'm at as well, and that I view it as two sides of a very similar coin. And that to borrow from internet vernacular that I am learning in this role, I think the pair of them help people be seen and heard. And the activism is the being seen, and the advocacy side is the being heard by the right people in positions to influence it. And for me, I'm an academic and the more research brain, but for me, the advocacy side is more getting that change made from inside of the systemic structure. And the activism side is showing the structure what's wrong. And so Akanksha actually does this beautifully on social media. If you go through CASA's posts, which follow, like, subscribe, shameless plug, but you'll see that when she frames something, she talks about how this is an issue for students. So right now, as we're filming this, it's open ed week. So talking about the cost of textbooks and how onerous that is for a lot of different students, but then talking about solutions at the same time. And when they're government related and system related, that's where we get into the advocacy side. So it's not just textbooks are onerously expensive. It is, so here's what's needed, whether that's more grants, whether that's more different loan arrangements, or just advocating for open educational resources, that this is a great tool that can alleviate a lot of burden for a lot of people and also make knowledge accessible, which is kind of a win-win-win if we want to borrow the triple bottom line vernacular that's getting popular. And so that frame is making sure that people feel included and can go, oh yeah, that sucks for me too. Yeah, I'm definitely, yes, I'm heard, I'm seen here. And then getting that in with the advocacy approach with a direct ask that is evidence informed and has a solution oriented to it as well. It's not just textbooks suck.
Absolutely. I think a lot of students don't tend to realize that by sharing all that info on their social media, they're being part of the solution. And so it's equally as helpful as us sitting in meetings with politicians. So I love that. The next part is that I know a lot of students, especially on our SMU campus, are kind of always wondering about the in-depth explanation of what exactly the Canadian Alliance of Student Associations is. They see it on our social media or when I'm sharing information. But I'm hoping it's kind of the second last talk before we wrap up. You can give kind of the spiel about what CASA is. Maybe I'll let Kalin start and then pass to Akanksha after.
For sure. And I'll note that I'm used to having to do this in both languages. So if you need it in French, I'm happy to repeat it all. The CASA is a not-for-profit, nonpartisan organization that represents student associations to the federal government. And we advocate for a post-secondary system that is affordable, accessible, innovative, and of the highest quality. And we've been doing this since 1995. We are not new. We've been doing this for 25 years. That's older than many undergraduate students and college students today. And in that time, we've seen a lot of changes that have really gone above and beyond to make post-secondary more affordable than ever before. We've been big advocates for the Canada Student Grant, which is upfront non-repayable aid, and making sure that these systems work for students, not just the structures themselves. We believe that we are member driven. So voices like Sam's and Bryn's are what come forward to the table, and we take the direction from student leaders on what's important to them on their campuses and bring that from coast to coast to coast, and then come up with ideas. We research it. We are known for being well researched and evidence informed and coming to government with solutions that will make lives better for students. That is the slow pitch. I'm happy to talk more, but we work for students by making it more affordable and accessible at the federal level. That's where we exist exclusively. And we also act by bringing student leaders together from coast to coast so that they know that they have support and can share wisdom and share ideas from what's working on their campuses, so that, you know, something that you're facing at SMU, maybe folks at Capilano have already faced it, and you can share that wisdom and those resources with one another to make everything better for students across Canada. And how students can get involved if they're not on their SU is like and share our content and make your voices heard, and also get involved with your SU. So run for an exec position, be on the council, be involved in events, just get involved in your campus is the best way to get involved and make things better.
Absolutely. Akanksha, is there anything you'd like to add there? Perfect. So the last thing that I kind of want to touch on before we wrap up, we're coming into the time, like Kalin mentioned, when student executive members would likely call it transition time, when students start to consider applying for exec roles or maybe even running an election. So if you could give incoming or interested student leaders one piece of advice, what would it be? And maybe I'll start with Akanksha this time.
I think for me, that the biggest piece of advice I would give to anybody that is, you know, starting to work in student leadership or is looking to be interested is that you have to build a strong connection with your campus, whether that's through, you know, talking to other students, whether that's through having meaningful conversations through a student club or through an event. I think it's absolutely important that you actually build a comprehension of what your campus looks like. And someone that I really look up to, he was a former general manager with the student association for years, like a very, very long time. I'm not going to age him, but he once said to me, and it's a value that I've really held close to my heart, that if you can't keep your pulse on the student heartbeat, then how can you claim to represent them? And I think that is something that I'm constantly going back to in all the work that I do, whether it was as a student leader or even now as I transitioned over to working with CASA, is if I can't understand what it's like to be a student, then how can I claim to represent those kind of students? And you don't have to be a student right now to understand what it's like, or you don't have to be, you know, part of that community to fully understand it. Obviously, when you're in student leadership, you do have to be a student, but it is important that you really try to hone in on the experience of what it's like to be a student that, you know, came from a first generation background, or an immigrant student, or a student who comes to campus, doesn't speak English, and now is, you know, asked to go and get mental wellness supports that are all only in English. So I think it's really, really important that you're going and trying to really understand what it is the pulse of campus is, and how can you best represent that heartbeat, not only to your own university, not only to your municipal and provincial governments, but at CASA, we really try to strive to bring that genuine student, authentic voice into our advocacy to make sure that it's you that's being represented at the table, or that it's individual voices that coming together are being represented at the table. So that would be my number one piece of advice.
Absolutely, I love that. And I'll pass it to Kalin.
On the connection thing, I'll pivot a little bit, is to also make sure that you're setting yourself up with really good self-care and community care strategies as you're beginning your term and transitioning into it. The life of a student leader is one that will have a lot of ups and downs. And, you know, 2021 is shaping up to be much like her chaotic older sister, 2020. There's going to be curveballs. It's going to get stressful. But to have those strategies in place. And I joke with membership and at home office that just to remind yourself that you are a houseplant with complicated emotions. And so to treat yourself with kindness, but also drink water, give yourself some food, get some sunlight, the very, very basic things to care for yourself. Because if you're burnt out and stressed out, it doesn't matter if you have the pulse of the student body, you're not able to serve anyone. So to make those strategies and make those plans, and as you're thinking about everything you're going to accomplish, building in that care of yourself at the same time.
Absolutely. I think forgetting to eat is the number one skill you learn in student leadership. So
yeah,
sure that you're eating on a daily basis and drinking your water.
Put down the coffee, grab a water every now and then.
Yeah, exactly. Well, thank you so much, Akanksha and Kalin. It's always a pleasure. And I think the advice and insight you gave today is really going to be helpful for students, not only wanting to move into student leadership potentially, but also learning how they can advocate for themselves on a daily basis. Thanks so much. And make sure to everyone to check out part 1 of our Advocacy 101 series if you haven't already. So thank you.
Thanks, Sam.